Hello, I'd like to introduce you to my Applied Anatomy and Physiology book, and I'm Brian, and the last name is pronounced Shmaefsky, and I'd like to just give you a brief introduction to myself. I am a professor of biology and environmental sciences. I'm an environmental toxicologist slash physiologist, and I teach at Lone Star College, Kingwood, as a college instructor, but also I teach early college high school instruction to students in the sciences. So I have this audience of 16 to 18-year-old students, and that's given me a lot of insight into teaching at the high school level because my book is written for a high school level based on this experience for several years. And I do teach much of the time on actually a high school campus. So I truly understand the dynamics of your classroom. I'm also chair of the institutional review board for my college because I believe this gives a lot of application for my knowledge, and also I base some of my case studies and teaching on what I've learned by evaluating clinical research to animal research and all sorts of studies on my campus. My background is I don't do research anymore because my institution does not require that, but I used to do environmental toxicology, physiology research, particularly with water quality and on endocrine disruptors and how they affect wildlife and people. Currently, I work in policy and I work with human water rights and in humanitarian efforts. So I've done some work in just foreign countries. Particularly, I just got done with a project in Bangladesh on the impacts of a certain pollutant. And I've worked in the Philippines, Colombia, Honduras, and other areas, basically using my knowledge for human rights, particularly with water quality, and even worked with some of the Flint, Michigan people. So it's a great application of my knowledge that goes beyond my academic training. My first job actually at a high school was I was in an X-ray technology program and actually got to work in a clinical, hospital setting in New York City for a while. And this is where I really developed an interest in school because I wasn't the greatest student throughout K to 12. And this really sparked my interest in science because I was not doing well in science and I didn't see much of a need for science at one time, but this really honed it in for me. And what's funny is I didn't really like so much being in a hospital. I started really liking the knowledge of what I was doing. Um, After my undergraduate, I landed a job very luckily at the New York Aquarium Research Labs in Coney Island, New York, as an animal forensic pathologist. So I helped researchers with understanding diseases in everything from marine invertebrates to marine mammals. I've done forensic necropsies under the supervision of the federal government and police on identifying things that they didn't know were found floating in the ocean, to looking at causes of death for marine animals that were either kept in captivity or were found stranded or dead on New York City waterways. And that was an incredibly taught me how to apply my college education, and probably more than what I learned in college and anything else is I learned here how to apply that knowledge. So this really made great application of my college content. From that, I went on to graduate school, and then eventually, after my doctoral studies, my first job was not in academics, but actually in industrial biochemistry, working with human clinical products and also products that were made from human substances. So basically, I would collect anything from animal tissues to human tissues and extract the chemicals out of them and look at their uses in clinical and basic research. And this was the most toughest use of my knowledge because it really reinforced my chemistry and biochemistry, and how does how do you understand a cell to the point where you could extract particular compounds from the cell. Then I went on to university teaching, and eventually to where I am, where I'm teaching at a two-year college and at a high school. Professionally, I'm involved with many organizations that are directly related to the content of the book. I'm a member of the Human Anatomy Physiology Society, and I'm also a HAPS Institute graduate school instructor. I also belong to NSTA, NABT, American Institute of Biological Sciences, and also American Association for Advancement of Sciences and the Ecological Society of America. All these organizations are involved in the educational arms, but also I'm involved in using my research for public good. The reason why I'm happy to have my book with EMC Publishing, they invited me to write it, and I said yes, is because their philosophy is to engage, motivate, and connect. And I truly believe in this, and I truly, I've been teaching this way for a long time. And because I believe a student has to be engaged to learn, has to be motivated to learn, and has to be connected to the content. So when I approached the book, I approach it with my normal teaching style, and I teach using case studies. Every lesson starts with a case study, and I do manage to balance content, particularly in A&P, there's a lot of content to cover. So I worked out a model. I could use a case study to engage in the content and not just give rote. So the case study is allowing me to cover rote content, but also give it something that the students can cling on to and engage them with, because they know they have to learn that knowledge to understand the case I introduced. I use a very simple conversation style, and a lot of it, to be honest, I'm not a fluent writer. It's very difficult. I come from a household where English was one of 4 languages spoken around the house, and we would speak, a pidgin dialect of, a smattering of English, whatever, and that makes me sensitive to the bulk of my students who are, a lot of them are traditional students that are returning to college, after many years after high school, and also I'm in a primarily minority and Hispanic serving area, so a lot of my students, English is not their primary language, and I've had difficulty reading also English, so I try to keep it so that students can learn the content and not weaken the book and make it too simplistic, but give content in a way that's more understandable. So I try to be conversational so that it's speaking to the student and not above their head, but the content has rigor and does use the terminology they need to know. And I also, in the book, try to insert high interest features. I do this with my teaching too. I give content, and then a little interesting point and go from there, because I think this gives students a rest and a grasp of the content, and it engages them that, hey, sometimes this is fun to learn. The supplements of the book are the motivators. There's interactive supplements throughout each chapter that you can pick and choose. Students can pick and choose whatever they want to do, and then links to online activities. As I believe no textbook stands alone. And I know my book doesn't cover everything there is to know about anatomy and physiology, or it would be 7,000 pages long. It'll look like almost Gray's Anatomy, except it has physiology in it. So I give outside links because this is the students' real world too, to be online. So my students are online during class, which I know is a classroom management nightmare. I particularly learned that with my high school students, had to keep them off Facebook, other things, and cat videos. But I do want them to look up outside resources, and the book forces them to look at certain resources that I find to be valid, because I want them not to just go anywhere, but learn that there are certain resources that are reliable, very much like what clinicians do or what allied health people do. They have their certain sets of references. I connect with the students through real-world applications that, again, I pick from my experiences. Being an emergency responder, working in allied health fields, and just being a person in general who's come across these situations with many of the case studies. And then I highly believe in service learning. My parents gave back to the community. I continuously give back to the community through a lot of service learning, and all my students do service learning at one type or another. I know the service learning activities look redundant through the book, but I don't expect the students to do one for each chapter. So they can pick a chapter to do a service learning project that I have my students do in the past. So this is all an important aspect of the book and the foundation of using my book. So the goal of my book, the premises of my book, is to be accessible to host student population, to be engaging, to be relevant to life, their lives, and to the class. I want to reinforce student learning through critical thinking. That means the case study approach, and to promote particularly application and also civic engagement, because many of these case studies have to do where you're in a situation where you have to help a person, and you have to understand your limitations, but you're also gathering knowledge, maybe to help the first responder or to help that person in general. And this is relevant and evident throughout the book. It's relevant to the book and evident throughout the book. The book can either serve as an in-class tool or as an out-home reference. In many cases, I use my textbook as a reference, the rote component of the book. But also I have my students look at the supplements in the book and answer those, again, as an at-home studying tool. Not just to read the book and memorize it, but use the content, put it into action. And I want the book to support what goes on in the classroom. I think that's very fundamental because I have colleagues that make no use of the textbook supplemental materials whatsoever, and I find them to be very valuable and sometimes very creative ways of adapting my teaching so it's not all lecture and rote. So when I designed the book, I try to keep in mind that, particularly at the high school level, books have to meet standards. And that's also true for college. We have our own accreditation issues that textbooks have to be consistent with. But when I did the book, I said, oh my gosh, there's so many standards out there. So how do I write a book that distills all the components of things like the National Science Education Standards, the NGSS, the Common Core, but also takes into account the integrity of what human anatomy and physiology finds in college level and high school level textbooks, as far as content and the currentness of the book and all that type of those considerations. So what I tried to do is make sure that the book addresses a lot of this by looking at the holistic critical thinking aspects of this, to look at the content integrity of this. And also, I have been involved with HOSA, which is an incredible organization that is a supplement to allied health and A&P, type of coursework. And I'm not only an advisor to a group. I know my stepdaughter was actually active at her high school and also at the national level of HOSA and state level. And I use the components of the keys to success in HOSA for much of the materials of the book. And I've had students in our college chapter involved in, competitions and stuff. And one of our resources for the book, for the HOSA competitions, we use various resources, including my book, particularly look at the human aspects within HOSA. I was also lucky to work with National Allied Board certification exams and was invited to be on the revisions for the new MCAT through the American Association of Medical Colleges. And my book focuses on some of the newer MCAT aspects of looking at holistic physicians that understand mechanism and also understand ethical decisions, the psychology, and social dynamics. So the book tries to address these issues while trying to get in the relevant content. And some of the content is supplemented again through online, resources. So let us look at now how to use the case study and why the book is laid out the way it is. So this is a standard layout for each chapter. So the case study is right in the front of the book. It's brief. I try to keep it engaging, and I try to keep the case relevant to someone. So in this example of chapter 11, the case study uses a marathon as an example of what is going on. And it just basically gives some observations that a person would see if they were in this situation and saw somebody get injured or get sick. So I'm given a real situation, and this is something I actually ran into watching a friend do triathlons. As I wait at the finish line, you see people finish that get sick. And something happens, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's no first responders right here, and I'm the first person, and I have to either comfort this person or try to figure out what's going on so that when the first responder gets here, I could be of some help, or at least provide some assistance, or even just to understand if I'm talking to this person, maybe what's going on with their body. The case is not meant to make the person a mini doctor. It's not to identify the disease. It is there to what do you need to know about a situation. That's the goal of the case study, is not so much to answer it as to say, what information do I have that answers this? Because I've got questions from many teachers that use the book and said, I'm not a doctor, and I'm not allowed, to make a diagnosis. I was never trained to do that, and I don't want to. That's not the case. It's the case is to engage the student and say, what do I need to know? What do I know that can help with this? And right to the end of the book, the student might not know the diagnosis, but they might know why each sign and symptom, what it's connected to, and what is the physiological or anatomical explanation. That's all I want out of case studies. And that's really what, is done in the medical field. It's not to make a rapid diagnosis, but basically, what do I understand about this condition? And then how do I relate it to conditions that I could associate it with? Because it could be one, it could be many. And some of these case studies have more than one answer. So that's how we go about using them. So this is just the introduction. And you could use the case study as a student reading, where they answer the case study after going through the chapter, or you can use it in class as an opener for 1 or 2 lectures for a week, however you cover this. Use it as an opener and then provide the students with time to kind of look at the content and relate it to the case study. Many books don't do this. Many books start with a case study and never finish it. Or they give an answer at the end and never really explain throughout the chapter why the information was important in the chapter. So I'd like you to notice that this is based on my learning style and the way I was in college. I like to have concept check breaks. So the book, after a certain amount of information, has a concept check break, so the students don't have brain overload. And the concept checks are meant to, again, look at that specific content and say, what are the important terms, what are the important concepts, what do you know? And if you don't know, go back now, or the instructor, the teacher should say, man, they didn't get this, I can go back. So these are formative assessment checks, which could also be used for a grade assessment if you want to ensure that the students are paying attention to what's going on. And you can grade them on it. Now, the importance of the concept check is they then lead into, for many cases, not all of them, the CSI break. The CSI break is meant to now not be an answer. It's saying, what do you need or what do you don't need for the answer? And this is the important thing. That's why I don't give the teachers answers to these, because there aren't any. It's up to you. This is where you learn with the student and teach the student what is relevant or what is not. And I will give you an example of how I would walk through this. So these are not meant to be answered. This is meant for the student to write something down and for you to keep track of what are the students learning and how are they thinking, actually. Because I have students that will give totally off answers related to how the content is to the case study and go, well, that, maybe is not necessary. Because what's equally important is what you don't need to know. You don't need a lot of this information because it just confounds the situation. And this is what's important about cases. In case study teaching, we teach up front, what information do I need, what do I not need, and what past information. That means some of these case studies rely on previous chapter content. So what information have I learned before, not just in this case study, is there, and students can write that there too. That's all open. So you're given a worksheet. I believe it's in a Word doc form. And you can modify this, but I want the students to have this as they're going through the case study. And they can write down, of course, specific factual details of the case. And then as they go through the CSI breaks, they take a moment to jot stuff down in the breaks and write down what I need to know, what I don't need to know. So this is what this part of the supplement is for. And this is available for you to use, for you to run off, and you can modify it. I really don't mind if you modify materials, because I just wrote this for my teaching and how I think case studies should be done, but that's not true for how. So now I'm going to give you a case study of your own. But before we figure out what's going on here, let me give you an example of how I would want my students to approach this and how I would approach this. So let me look at just an example from my textbook on chapter 1. Chapter 1 is that horrible chapter that covers everything in the beginning, everything from, anatomical features to terms and whatever, and students just find it a burden. And I ended up, just giving worksheets after worksheets to get students to remember this. And they really don't understand that this is to be useful later in the chapter. I mean, and also, in the book, throughout the book, that I need to know terms, I need to know anatomical positions, I need to know this, I need to know surface features and stuff like that. So what I do with that is the case study given there is something I've actually run into being a cook. I mean, I've taken chef lessons. I like international cooking. I've traveled internationally and learned the different cooking styles, and I feed my family, international meals. But I've also seen many accidents in kitchens and in myself, where I've stabbed myself and burned myself. And in the food industry, the worst industries you see is when a person is cutting something big and stabs themselves in the stomach with a knife. And that's the case. And this is something you see at home. This is something you see at restaurants and in industry. So I picked that as a case. So when the students first see that case, they're going, wow, and some students might say, yeah, my Uncle Ernie did that once and whatever, or I got poked once, with a pencil, and, and I thought, man, if that punctured me, that could have been a problem. So the beginning of the chapter with the first CSI break doesn't help them. It just gives a bunch of terms. Now, you might push it and say, well, you need to know the term anatomy, gross anatomy and fine anatomy. Where does the term gross anatomy come in a case study? Well, the knife went into a certain major body region. Okay, That's fine. What about fine anatomy? What does fine anatomy cover? Well, that starts talking about cells and tissues. Well, could that be important that you understand the term fine anatomy? Yes, but that's about it. Nothing else helps you with that case. And the same is true for the second CSI break. There's little to help. And that's part of learning. That's part of knowledge, is sometimes you learn things that are not particular to a particular case. And then it gets to the third CSI break in chapter 1. And now this is where students start going, oh my gosh, abdominal regions. Look, the knife went into an abdominal region. And this is what I think when I see an injury is, oh my gosh. And I've done this to myself, where I stuck a knife into my hand, or I was trimming hedges and slashed right into the, my arm or something, and going, okay, it went this deep. It's in this part of the arm, what was affected, and I'm trying to see through my body. So in that case now, I'm trying to give the students this whole idea of you're in an abdominal region. Now, from the surface of that region, why do we name these abdominal regions? Because there's things underneath. And we always make the students memorize the organs underneath. So now they're talking about, oh my gosh, what organs are impacted? And now what else do I need to know? How deep did the knife go? Because if it just went in superficially, it just affected the skin, and maybe whatever's underneath the skin, superficially. And my gosh, wow, I'm using it too superficially, but if it's a deep knife wound, what do you mean by deep? How deep? Where's the stomach? Where's this? Where's that? So now they're thinking. And that's how I want to approach the case studies. So sometimes a CSI break, you learn nothing that's applicable, and others you do. And it's going to vary. And that's how I purposely layered a book, that some of them are bland, and some of them are important. And students have to learn that learning is that way. So I want students to learn. Metacognition, understand how they learn, because this is valuable. So now I'm going to give you one, and you've been staring at it for a while. So here's a case that I give my students, and I also give professionals when I'm doing case study teaching, because I like this case. And this case I put in on purpose in one of my books. It is put into one of my books, and it's put into the skeletal system. I could have put it in tegumentary system, which I was torn between, putting it in both and discussing different things. But this is a very unusual condition. And some of you right now are going through your minds, my gosh, what is that? But I'd like us to assess this and think about this. This is a very rare disease, but I want you to focus on certain aspects of it. Look at the skull. Look at that stuff on the skull. Is that actually, frontal bone, occipital bone protrusions? I mean, what's going on there? And look even over the, right here, right around your temporal bone, is that skin? Is this mummification? Could be. I mean, what's going on here? Because students will ask this too, and say, no, it's not a mummy. This is a skeleton. This is a person's skeleton, that all the non-skeletal tissues were removed. And that goes, really? Wow. Because they're looking at this too. And they're also thinking about, how do you treat this? Look at this. What is this? So as we look at this case study, what I'd like you to do is think about, how does this case apply to skeletal system? And what is it, what you teach in skeletal system, that is applicable for understanding this case study? So I'm going to give you a little time where I'm going to be uncomfortably silent and let you just think about this. Talk to it, pick a person that you're sitting next to talk to, or form a team of 4, whatever you want to do, and just discuss this for a little while. And don't try to diagnose it. Just say, what do I need to know in skeletal system coverage to resolve this case? Okay, I think that's enough of silence right now. It feels very uncomfortable here, and I do want to keep this presentation somewhat brief. So what I like to do is move on to the next slide. So why do I love this case study in particular? Because when we teach about skeletal system, we go, the one information that doesn't appear relevant to students is, why do I have to memorize bone shape? Why don't why do I have to know about long bones, short bones, irregular bones and flat bones? And why is there discrepancy in the literature between like the clavicle being a long bone or a flat bone, which now the evidence is leaning towards flat bone? And when I teach every chapter, I know I don't do this thoroughly in my book because it's difficult to do, but I cover embryology with each chapter so that students know how each body system organ is related to itself during embryological development. And this is a particular case of that. And so my students already, when I go through this case, they're primed, even though they don't know they're primed to notice, because they know that the integumentary system has some components that are integrated with the skeletal system, even though the skeletal system is a different, it's more endodermal versus ectodermal, but they learn that there is a connection that's very important that links these two systems. So when we teach about bone, we talk about bone shape and students are like, oh my gosh. And then we teach about bone formation. It tends to link to bone shape sometimes, because when you get into regular bones, they could be endochondral or intramembranous. But we use these terms endochondral and intramembranous, and we don't really go into the full discussion of what they really are. Endochondral, is more of a genetic development where you get the bone pegs, and all of us teach that, I'm sure, but it's laid down by genetics, particularly these things called Hox genes, because I do mention that a little in the genetics coverage of books, because these lay down your plan. The intramembranous bone is a little more tricky, because it's not really genetically set. It's a looser genetic signaling that is more of what we call reaction tissue. And it's actually part of the healing process, believe it or not, really not part of the bone development process. And I'm not going to go into a whole lecture on that. You can email me about that. So what's going on here is the way I apply this is I'm having the students first figure out, okay, here's real bone, skeletal system. What the heck is that? That doesn't look like skeletal system. And some students say that looks like muscle. That could look like skin. Some of this could look like tendon, ligament, especially the thin guys there. And what the heck is going on there? And is the patient born this way? So I say, no, it's developmental. And what's really bad about this? When doctors try to treat it, they'll try to cut these, break them out. It gets worse. It's like a keloid. As you cut it and work with it, if you're not careful, these grow back bigger and form more. And as a person moves and these tear and rip and break, more forms. And eventually this consumes the whole person's body. But unfortunately, luckily for the patient, they die before that happens. And it also, in some cases, causes the person to suffocate because it can occur in the intercostal regions. So what you're seeing here is an abnormality of intramembranous bone growth. And what's funny is intramembranous bone growth is very big in other animals. It forms dermal plates. It does other things that we see that humans don't do, except we have this primitive ancestral ability to make dermal plates. We can turn any tissue, including our internal organs, into ossified structures. And it has occurred, it's occurred in fetuses that are stillborn. So this is what happens when intramembranous bone growth takes over other tissues. And these people, and now I want the students to think about the implications. They become immobilized, they can stop breathing, they can't move, and when they do move, these things crack and break. And think about if that's occurring along fascia, it's that occurring along a nerve tract, that could be painful and even rip the nerve, damage the nerve. So any connective tissue is open to that. Every connective tissue has some type of mesenchymal memory during healing. This is the embryological tissue, which can produce fibrocytes or I should say fibroblasts or osteoblasts. In this case, osteoblasts, instead of forming in bone tissue, form in other tissue. And this is a beautiful case. It uses chapter content, and I don't use this as a starting case in the book, but other cases that are much more relevant and obvious. So what is the disease called? Because everybody asked me. It's fibrodysplasia ossificans progressa, and this can occur in various parts of the bodies. There's variations that occur in internal organs, and in some cases you can find this very rarely in the meninges and other structures. So this is what's beautiful about it. We've learned applications of content that is very, very difficult, and it gives relevance. And this disease is my catch for teaching sometimes the connection between integumentary system, the immune system on how the body heals, cell signaling, and on the skeletal system, and even muscular system, because this has components that associates itself with the skeletal system, with attachment points. So, don't be afraid of using case studies. And also, Adam, if you're using it with the book, it's an incredible resource that goes along with this book. And that's why I was glad when EMC made a connection with Adam. I've used it in my teaching, years ago, and have just loved it. And I find it a valuable resource for myself. But feel free to have students use Adam as a supplement for reinforcing the content. My students, when we're doing case studies, they know the class starts with a case study. They're sitting there with their phone in their lap to make it look like they're concentrating. They're typing in certain components of the case study to see if they can find it. And most of the time they don't. They end up with 15 types of diseases or conditions. And that's what I love, because there isn't an answer. And I say, stop doing that. Look for bits and pieces to help answer it. But right now you're just learning at what information is relevant or not. And it's really kind of funny when they do find the relevant information and they type it into a search, they find out that they're more likely to get the disease rather than typing in all the extraneous information too that they think about when they look at the case. So make use of the book. Do not be afraid to use the case studies, and don't worry about the CSI breakpoints having no answers, because this is real life. What I want you and the students to do is be facilitators with each other, and you using that as a formative assessment tool for how the students value content. Because you could read the ending of the case study, learn what the disease is before you go into it, read, and I give you the high points of the case study. I tell you what's important, and then you could use that knowledge to basically say, okay, why did you pick this as an important fact and that? And don't tell the students they're wrong. Just say that I think there's something that you're missing, or why do you need to know that, and let them make the right and wrong decision. That's my approach to teaching. I know particularly at the high school level, they're a little intimidated by having this professor in their class and whatever. Sometimes they intimidate me because, they know I don't know how to discipline them a lot. So, but I want them to understand that I don't know everything, and that what makes me different than a dictionary is that I could apply the content. Facts don't mean application. I want them to know that there's a lot of facts in my head that I don't use sometimes, and sometimes I never use certain details because they're not relevant until they do pop up. So that's the goal of my book, and I'm so happy that you have the book and you'll be using it. So please, I know I can't answer your questions now, but if you have any questions, please email me. I monitor this site. It's a dedicated email for the book. Please ask me any questions about the content. If you have issues with a case study, let me know. And also, since this is the second edition of a book, generally what happens when we rewrite a book is I make mistakes with editing. And sometimes I'm writing a book, to be honest, middle of the night to get it done, so I can introduce errors that weren't captured in the first book. So the users sometimes become the eyes. And if you and I'd like also some feedback on other resources we can provide. I'd love to have a blog where teachers can share information about how to use the book in some of their own case studies and things that they do to supplement my book. Feel free to supplement the book with your resources, but please let me know. And again, I'm open to answering questions. And if you do find any errors in the book or issues that are controversial, there are controversial areas of A&P. And what I do is pick the best explanation for the time. And sometimes you'll find conflicting information. It's also true for even just simple things like identifying flat bones and, irregular bones and, long bones. So there's going to be things that differ. And if there's typos, please let me know, because, particularly when I review a 600-page book that I wrote, I miss a lot of my mistakes because I'm perfect, and I don't make mistakes, but I'm open to that. But again, email me if you have any questions. I love hearing from teachers, and I'm always free to do, brief in-services. So thank you.